Take five. Hi, my name is Demir Sturmel, and in 1983, I was a graduate student at the graduate faculty of the New School for Social Research in New York City. I was in the liberal studies program. We had a visiting professor in the spring of '83. His name was Harold Bloom, and I'd never heard of him. But someone had told me that he was maybe the preeminent literary critic of our age. And so I took his class, and I went into the first class, and he blew me away. I didn't have a clue as to what he was talking about and how he was making these connections about, we were talking about the Torah and the early writers of the Torah in that first session. So I brought a tape recorder, a little Sony Walkman cassette tape recorder, handheld with a stereo mic. I taped most of the rest of the sessions that we had that semester. So there's 10 tapes out there. If you haven't already discovered them and would be interested in hearing Dr. Bloom in a small classroom setting, I think they're pretty unique and pretty interesting. But my story today is this is a recording that you're going to hear of my going in to visit Dr. Bloom to talk about the paper that I have to write at the end of the semester. And this isn't the first visit. This is the second visit. The first visit occurred in early March, I believe we reference in the tape. And he had given me this topic of, he said, why don't you write about the concept of sublimation in the text of Nietzsche and maybe how that relates to how Freud viewed it differently. And also maybe you could find some clues about about the origins of sublimation in the writings of Plato through, one of these Socratic dialogues. And so I went off and I was reading, some Plato and Nietzsche and Freud and looking for, how things get sublimated in them. And I was really struggling because I didn't have the philosophical background and I didn't have the literary background. So I went in to see him again thinking, well, I'm just going to get him to give me something easier to write about. And, you'll see in the conversation here, he just wouldn't have any of that. He was committed to having me commit to writing about the concept of sublimation. And so I wasn't going to publish this, but one of the readers or one of the listeners of the other classes, Charles Lincoln IV, this is for you, requested that I publish this because I mentioned it in a comment. So here it is, one-on-one with Harold Bloom. You get a real taste of what it was like to be with the man. Enjoy.
Tell me about your work.
Oh,
I know nothing about it.
I'm claiming Socratic ignorance.
But I will simply counter with the same. But you must tell me what you want to do.
Okay, I had been in to talk to you about 2 months ago.
I remember that.
We had discussed doing some sort of work, paper on Nietzsche, discussing sort of his sublimations of Plato. Which
I remember we talked about the whole question of sublimation.
Right. So I would very much like to do that. I'm just finding that the background that I have in order to be able to write the paper that I think I want to write is just very insufficient.
There is no book, as far as I know, in any language that I can read, which has handled the complex question of how different the thing sublimation is, say, in Plato, Nietzsche, and Freud. They have three very different views of sublimation, and it's very difficult that they should use in the end the same word or the same notion for three very different ideas. Did I mention to you the rather intelligent discussion of Freudian sublimation, which does contrast it with both Nietzsche and Plato, though briefly, in Philip Reef's book called Freud, the Mind of the Moralist? Take a look at that. There's now a standard paperback edition of it published by the University of Chicago Press. He's the fellow who edited many of the Freud volumes of you. Philip Reef, R-I-E-F-F. It's a book called Freud, the Mind of the Moralist, first published a long time ago. Look up sublimation in the index and look up his references to it. He usefully does contrast, though very briefly, but interestingly, Freud's notions of sublimation with Plato's and Nietzsche's. And then there's the Christian view of sublimation, which is not Platonic, not Nietzschean, and not Freudian. So that makes it very complex.
So, I just want to, I think, focus in on maybe say the differences between Nietzsche and Plato.
It was an interesting book, if I remember properly. I think the man's name was Irving Singer, Singer. It was about love. It might have been called The Nature of Love, something like that, a number of years ago, which also contrasts Pauline, Christian, Freudian, and Nietzschean ideas of sublimation. Since after all, there's always eros, which is being sublimated. There's always love, which is being... You might look at that also. Those would be about the only things I can think of. It's a very difficult subject. Terribly difficult.
Oh, really?
Yeah, horribly difficult. I don't have much to suggest. I mean, I would look at the Singer book. I can't remember the exact title, but love is in the title. The Nature of Love may actually be the title. I would certainly look at the Reed book. You might look at Dennis de Rougemont's rather curious book called Love in the Western World, which tries to talk about unsublimated loves. And then there is Norman O. Brown's most peculiar book denouncing the possibility of sublimation, which was called Life Against Death. But they lead you afield, I think. I mean, if you want to stick to the question of what Nietzsche and Freud and Plato or St. Paul say about it, then you're in a different area as to what the possibilities of sublimation are.
Okay.
In Nietzsche, the principal text is undoubtedly the genealogy of laws, especially the discussion of the ascetic ideal. It's also the most remarkable single book that even Nietzsche ever wrote. And there's a good standard English version of it translated by Arthur Kaufman, though the commentary is not to be trusted.
I've been reading that over, so I should just stick to reading the text over.
Yeah. I've worked on Nietzsche. I mean, the most persuasive and complicated thing in the first volume that has now been translated is Heidegger's vast book on Nietzsche, but that is a huge ontological critique and does not touch on the issue of sublimation. There's a book by Karl Jaspers on Nietzsche, which does talk about sublimation in Nietzsche. But rather bewildering, but I mean, go ahead and wing it, as you said. It's a very dangerous subject, but it's fun.
Yeah.
It's very fun.
I think
I myself learned this
deal.
work, and I speak as the merest amateur in all of these areas of thought. I doubt that there is such a thing as sublimation. I mean, I would say that what Freud calls sublimation is just a metaphor for metaphor itself. It's not an actual defense, because I don't think sublimation is possible for human beings. Repression is possible, but sublimation is not. You do not work instead of love, which is basically what the Freudian idea of sublimation is. I think that's always an illusion, but otherwise, as you say, you must wing it, my dear.
Well, while I have you here, I've been getting into reading. I was reading Paul de Man. You had suggested I do that, and somewhat baffled just by trying to understand what he's saying. Could you give me any, say, introductory text into deconstruction or structuralist thinking?
Yes, there's one good little book on it by a man named Christopher Norris. It's a tiny little paperback book called Deconstruction by a man named Christopher Norris, N-I-R-R-I-S. It's in all the bookstores. It's a tiny little inexpensive paperback. The other things introducing deconstruction are very stupid, but this is by a Britisher or a Welshman. It's a very clever piece of work. Deconstruction by Christopher Norris. He has a very clever account of the Barn and Derrida. A good book.
All right, very good. Thank you.